Welcome to Health and Safety Conversations. Here's your host, Tom Borne.
Hi, and welcome to Health and Safety Conversations. I'm your host, Tom Borne, and with me today is the absolutely marvellous and inspiring Nayab Sultan. Nayab, how are you?
I'm very well, Tom. Thank you very much for the invite.
No problem at all. Now, Nayab, whereabouts are you located at the moment?
So you'll tell from my funny accent, I was born and raised in the UK, but I live in the west coast of Canada in Vancouver.
Oh,
So at the moment, it's in the west coast,
okay.
but I tend to work internationally as well. So
Absolutely. Now, I know a little bit about you and your impressive background and your education and what you've actually achieved professionally. But for those who haven't heard of you and what you've achieved so far, can you give us a little bit of background on what you've done and where your professional journey began?
Sure. So, my journey actually started probably around 35 years ago. I started through teaching lifeguards how to swim and teaching aquatic first aid. When I left, as I was towards the tail end of my schooling, unfortunately, I developed pericarditis, which is basically an inflammation of the heart, which meant that I had to miss my O levels at the time, which was very disappointing for me. So I ended up thinking, well, the day after I left school, I got a job as a lifeguard, and I basically took it from there. And what I realized was that water safety, aquatic safety, teaching first aid came very naturally to me. And so that was really where the seed was planted. Now, oddly enough, the very first day of my job, within the first hour, oddly enough, I was asked by a supervisor to go and clean one of the changing rooms in this particular outdoor swimming pool in a place called Brockwell Lido in Brixton, for those who have traveled to London. And unfortunately, what happened was that previously somebody had poured some chemicals down the drain. And when I mixed my chemicals in a bucket of water, there was a reaction, and there was a reaction. And so unfortunately, what happened was that I became overcome by this gas, which I suspect was probably some kind of chlorine-based material. And it basically meant that I had to be pulled out of that area by one of my co-workers. And cut a long story short, I basically got blamed for it by the health and safety officer. And he said, well, you shouldn't have been mixing chemicals. And I said, well, I didn't. Honestly, I didn't. I just put the chemical in a bucket of water, and there you go. And so that sort of lit a fire under me, thinking, well, hold on, I must have some rights. And I know the basics of chemistry because I'd obviously been to school. And so that actually led to me spending all of the money that I earned, absolutely every pound and penny, to pay for a diploma in safety. Now, at the time, safety in the late 80s wasn't really a discipline that most people followed. It was something that perhaps you did by default as part of a job function. So in my case, I decided to put everything that I had, everything that I'd earned, into learning about safety. And I really didn't do it for any other reason besides wanting to know if I was right, And so fortunately, it came naturally to me. I think I was like a sponge at the time. I'd never studied safety, so I just absorbed everything. And the 3-year course I managed to do in 5 months. And unbeknown to me, I got the highest grades ever in the history of the professional board exams. I wasn't aware of this at the time, but they sort of mentioned it to me a couple of years later that, oh, you're that chap Nayab who we use your answers as the template of the model answers. So really for me, I was told by my peers that you're pretty good at the safety stuff. You should think about it as a career. And so that's really where the seed, like I said, the seed was planted through my water safety. But then once I did that program, I realized that perhaps I knew a little bit more than I gave myself credit for. Fast forward some years later, I ended up working as a safety officer. with the Channel Tunnel, which is the underground, sort of under the sea connection between England and France. And that's where I really learned a lot about safety. I mean, really grassroots at the point of work, seeing, smelling, tasting, feeling everything that these guys and girls are exposed to. So it became a very good practical training ground for me. And that's really where the fundamentals of my safety career started as a safety officer back in the late 80s. And I think at that time also I realized very quickly that I perhaps was a little bit different from my fellow safety officers. Most of the guys that I was working with typically did the job because it was paid employment. For me, I came through passion. And that conviction of why I wanted to learn, I wanted to make sure that I was always correct and accurate, led to me having a real different mindset. My mindset was very much about labor protection, human rights, public safety, public environmental, occupational health and safety. And that was really where my mind was different. I realized that that was something that was important to me. And I've never really looked back since. I've got degrees in occupational hygiene. I have several master's degrees. I have an honorary doctorate from Malawi for my work in occupational health and safety there. And currently I'm doing a doctorate. I'm hoping to do a Doctor of Public Health in occupational health and safety, specializing in silicosis, which is really my area of expertise now that I've mastered over the years. So that's really me in a nutshell. I don't know if I missed anything, but
let me fill in a few gaps that you humbly have forgotten there. Okay, you've worked with basically Safety Without Borders. You're a specialist for registered expert for the United Nations, currently on call. You have achieved a lot. You've done a lot of work with South African coal miners. You've done an incredible amount of work. And look, without giving compliments that aren't necessary, thank you, because you've done a lot to help workers. You've done a real lot to help workers. And to be honest, a year ago, I'd never heard your name. And it was like, so congratulations. I would suggest, but because of your background, you've also got a very strong social justice bent. Would that be correct?
That's correct. I definitely, I think humility was important for me. I come from very humble backgrounds, being born and raised in the slums of London, a place called Hackney, which was notorious for drugs and violence and crime, etc. I used education as a means to sort of empower myself. I stayed away from those temptations by throwing myself in my sports and trying to learn things. So I think you're absolutely right. This social justice aspect is important, which is why the very first opportunity I got to get some international experience, I took it. I managed to, I had an uncle living out in St. Vincent in the Grenadines in the Caribbean. And I had an opportunity to work as a volunteer safety professional. And when I went to St. Vincent, I realized I was the only one there, the only person qualified in safety, occupational health and safety. I was still a young guy. I was only probably around 22, 23 at the most. So what that did was it gave me an amazing opportunity, because I got to work as a safety professional, but not just at an enterprise level, at a national level, to be able to understand policies, procedures, regulations, international conventions, and things of that nature. So what really has made me different from my peers, Tom, is that I've always had a parallel career. I've always been a health and safety officer or a health and safety professional, but I've also been a specialist in occupational health and safety, specializing in developing countries. And that's really where my real passion is, on that development side. And that's why things like opportunities that came up in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to be the advisor, to work with Botswana, Namibia, Malawi, now more recently with Eswatini, which is the old name for Swaziland. I took them, and in most cases they have been pro bono appointments. I don't earn a nickel, but I see it as a great opportunity to contribute back to society. Most of my peers, bless them, there's no criticism on health and safety professionals. They tend to keep their focus usually on their occupation or their learning journey, is their individual journey. But for me, I definitely feel that I have an obligation. I'm not being self-righteous, but I have an obligation to share that knowledge and share it with those who need it the most. And I've definitely seen some really heartbreaking scenarios, which always remind me that I'm doing the right thing. And the United Nations thing has been definitely the cherry on the cake for me in terms of trying to work with them whenever as the necessity arises. Recently, I remarried back last year in March. And in February, I had an opportunity. It was a great opportunity to work for the UN as a safety professional at their World Coordination Base out in southern Italy. And I chose not to take it, even though it would have been a great position because I wanted to get married the next month. But those sorts of opportunities do come up, but they're very, very specialized positions. It's not just you've done an NEBOSH qualification, or you've done a particular certificate. That aspect of understanding social justice, labor protection, human rights becomes an integral part of that, in addition to your OHS competencies.
Okay. I'm going to ask a question which just sprung to mind, and it's something I believe in, because a little bit like you, I come from a very poor background. I mean, we were dirt poor when we first started, and the one thing that the best thing my mother ever did for me was instill in me the value of education. She just encouraged it. She had to leave school at 14 because her parents wouldn't support her going to school, but she can still continue to learn. All right, this is the question I have for you, and it's probably a bit controversial. Is safety a socio-economic issue?
Is it a socio-economic issue?
Insofar as the poorer the people, the poorer the environment, are the workers put more at risk?
100%. I would definitely say yes. I definitely notice it more in developing countries. And now, it's a funny thing. It's a good question. It's a valid question. I do have professional disagreements with some of my peers. There's this misconception that everything that we do in the West, i.e. whether it's in Northern Europe or North America, Australia, New Zealand, etc., the traditional European type environments, that we're leading the race. We're front and center. We're the best at what we do. And that actually isn't quite true, because having been around the world, having worked in different environments, I would say that we tend to follow quite often, and then we refine things and we modify things. But usually the seed that is planted is based on the fact that health and safety is used as a means of protecting people in their most vulnerable state. I remember the absolute worst job, and I still shudder when I think about this. I was in Afghanistan several years ago, and there was a little canoe type thing, and there were two guys in it. Now, they weren't in the canoe, they were out of the canoe in the water. Why this is something that shocked me was that it was actually an open sewer. And so what was happening was that they were up to their necks in this raw sewage, and they had a kind of this backward facing shovel, and they would dive down, and then they would scoop up the bottom of the canal, and then they would throw the effluent into the canoe so they could remove it so that the canal could continue to flow. And I remember thinking, my God, that has to be the absolute worst job ever, because you could smell this thing from miles away. But this guy, these two individuals, young chaps, would dive underneath the sewage to clean the canal. There's no, do you think that they had any protection in terms of occupational health and, vaccinations and wearing PPE, a safe system of work? If they drowned in it, they drowned in it. You couldn't get much worse than that. And I've definitely seen really hideous scenarios like that around the world. Another one I saw, and I remember I was sitting with a safety professional. He was a chemist by background. And we were parked at some traffic lights. And this again was in Afghanistan. And a lady came, tapped on the window. And I don't speak the language, Pashto, and she had a veil covered. And I thought it was for religious reasons. And he said, she's saying something to you. And then he translated for me. And basically what happened was she removed the veil and I saw no nose. There was no nose. You could actually see the skeletal structure of her jaw. And basically what he said was that was from working in a nickel plant or some kind of description where they were exposed to these acid vapors. And without any protection, what had happened was it ate away at their oronasal cavity. And she actually had this portion of her face was completely gone. And she was young. She must have been in her mid-20s. So socioeconomic, yes, definitely. I think we take a lot of things for granted in the West. We have protection, we have laws, we have standards, but that doesn't always apply around the world, even though there is legislation through the ILO, the International Labour Organization, that is there to set some basic minimum requirements, but there is a big discrepancy between those who have protection and those who don't. And that's why I do so much on the development side, because I see that time and time again, that people have virtually no protection whatsoever.
Yeah. All right, you've specialised, and as you said, you're specialising currently in lung health. I think
Yes.
that's the way to say it. And silicosis in particular. You did a lot of work with silicosis with South African miners. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So back several years back, as I mentioned, I had worked in Malawi as a professor, and had the opportunity to work in Botswana as well, and Namibia. I always was aware of the fact that Swaziland at the time was this small landlocked country of the Zulu warriors. But what made it particularly interesting to me, and I'll use the word interesting, was the fact that it had the world's highest prevalence rate of HIV and AIDS. 27% of the population have HIV and AIDS. And then once I started looking at the statistics, I started getting quite surprised and quite alarmed about how things were connected with tuberculosis, things were connected with silicotuberculosis through silica exposure, and malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, and these communicable and non-communicable diseases. And I thought, well, that's really out of the remit of an industrial hygienist and an occupational health and safety professional. But then what happened was, whilst I was looking at it, I read a small blurb from a chap who was in Eswatini talking about miners and there being no protection for these people, and how so many of them would work as migrant mine workers in South Africa, which is considered to have the richest, or amongst the richest gold reserves in the world. It was an opportunity that a lot of the menfolk had because of high unemployment rates. And they would go to South Africa, they'd work. And because of the time of apartheid, there was this issue with racism, blatant racism. They're a Bantu racial group, the Swazi, and they were treated very, very poorly. And they were given the worst jobs, Tom. They were absolutely given the absolute worst jobs. The white miners were sort of held back. They were in sort of the safe zone. They would go and do what they needed to do, the Afrikaners and the Europeans who'd go for work purposes. But the Bantu, or these particular Eswati miners, would be given the really dangerous jobs, the tough jobs. where they were also exposed to extremely high levels of silica dust and other contaminants. And when I started looking into it, I reached out to this gentleman. It was the time of before COVID, actually. And we ended up having a very interesting conversation. He also happened to be an OHS professional in a former life. He was a safety supervisor, I believe, in one of the mines. So he was a union rep. And then he started to tell me the challenges and the problems that they had. And I remember before the conversation was up, I said, how can I help? And that, was really the start of that relationship. Now, I continue with that even to this day, but the mandate has expanded exponentially. So what started as Eswatini in Swaziland is now Sub-Saharan Africa. And in my remit as the specialist in occupational environmental diseases, I look after 400,000 ex-miners and their dependents, and up to 1.7 million miners and ex-miners within that portion of Southern Africa. And I do it not on my own, of course. I do it through a team of health professionals who work in each individual country. But as the specialist in occupational environmental health, I then sort of explain to them, okay, if you're exposed to this type of substance or this type of contaminant, these are sorts of consequences of exposure, and this is how you do it. This is what you look for, explain biomarkers, etc. So it's probably the most rewarding of the roles that I've volunteered to assist with. And I definitely find that they need it. They need the support. There's a lot more to the backstory of this, which would be an interesting podcast itself. But it's something that very few people do. And I felt that it was important to try and make a contribution in whichever way I could. And they wanted to avail my OHS and hygiene skills for that.
Have you ever thought about writing a book? I can tell you now, it would be a very, very interesting book.
Sure. In fact, that's definitely something on the cards. I did write a book during the time of COVID with some of my colleagues in Chile and Peru on smoking and silicosis. And we're actually working on doing a silicosis encyclopedia, which will be a fantastic project to work on. And that's already started. So hopefully, watch this space in 2 years or so. There should be something announced on that.
Fantastic. All right. Just speaking about silicosis.
Yes, sir.
I'd say I don't know what it is internationally, how it's been in the news internationally, but I know in Australia for the last 2 years, it's been front and centre in safety circles. Just for those who may have had their head in the sand for a while, why is exposure to silica dust such a problem?
So silica or silicon dioxide is probably the second most abundant mineral in the Earth's crust after feldspar. It's everywhere. It's all around us. We tend to find it in sand, in rock, in different types of minerals. You find it in different places, and it's used extensively in industry for different manufacturing processes, whether you're making glass or tiles or bricks or whatever it might be. So as a raw product, as a particular mineral, silica, or respirable crystalline silica, should I be very specific, is just one of many types of silica dust. The other polymorphs, other versions of it, you could fill 2 pages of it. Right? There's a variety of different types of silica as they're referred to. But respirable crystalline silica is the one that we know that is commonly found in the occupational environment, in the working environment. And once it's in a respirable form, once it's broken down and it becomes airborne, on inhalation, it can actually cause some damage to the lungs, usually the upper lobes. It goes down because it's such a fine nanoparticle. The particles are absolutely microscopic, 0.02 microns per cubic meter. What tends to happen is that they'll just go down. And even the little hair and the mucus that we have as defenses, sometimes they're not enough, to stop the particles from going down. And so what tends to happen is they'll eventually get lodged into the lungs. So if you imagine the lungs themselves are like grapes, right? And those little alveolar sacs is where they tend to go down. And what they do is they lodge themselves in there, and that through a chemical reaction with also the macrophages, which is a defense mechanism that the body has, goes to try and deal with this foreign body. And what happens is a chemical reaction, and what happens is that portion of the lung tends to get scarred, which we call fibrosis, scarring of the lung. And the problem with silica dust in particular, and I'm going to refer specifically to silica dust, is even once the exposure is stopped, Tom, Nayab have been exposed to a lung full of this stuff, but even when we come out it, damage continues because it's there already. It's there physically, and it's going to continue doing its thing. Now, the problem with respirable crystalline silica is that most people tend to think that when you're exposed to inhalation hazard, it only affects the lungs. That's actually not true. In this particular case, it can cause a multiplicity of other silica-induced diseases as well, including nephrological stuff, i.e. relating to the kidneys. Because once you've inhaled it, it's in the system, the body's got to filter it out somehow. And usually it tends to go through the urine, through the filtering system. So you tend to find kidney-related issues. You tend to find autoimmune conditions where your immunological system gets compromised and it gets confused and it starts attacking itself. So you get things like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and things like that. We do get chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and lung cancer as well. Now, one of the things that I always remind people is that silica, or respirable crystalline silica, is a silicate, just as asbestos is. They're both silicates. They're both from the same family.
Yep.
Silica fibers are kind of small, and they tend to just go in and they'll cause damage, whereas the asbestos fibers tend to be like a spear. They get inhaled and then it's like puncture in there and then it causes damage. Exposure to silica can be very, very quick. Most people tend to associate, say, with asbestos, that it's going to take 15 to 25 years on average. And that's true. That tends to be the sort of the rough idea of how long it will take. Whereas with silica, it can happen from very large doses of silica exposure over a short period of time. And there's several examples of that in history. There's one particular scenario that happened in the US called Hawk's Nest in Western Virginia, where they were building a tunnel, and several hundreds, possibly even thousands, died as a result of acute silicosis. And because a lot of them were poor Southern Black workers, they didn't have any rights, and there was all sorts of controversy at that time in the 1930s. The real number of deaths was never really truly recorded, but we know that there are several examples like that. Even in Western Canada, Western US as well, we have many towns which are called or classed as ghost towns. Why is that? It's usually because the menfolk usually died because of the fact that they're exposed to so much silica dust, because of the fact that they were panning and chopping and they were, out working at the coalface, metaphorically speaking. And they were being exposed to high levels of this dust, and unfortunately it would catch up to them, especially if they were smokers and they had, say, predisposition to respiratory conditions. Back in the olden days, a lot of people had tuberculosis and didn't realize they had it, as an example, or their nutritional levels were a little bit on the weaker side, and an illness would sort of come and it usually would accelerate their decline in health. And we have that scenario in developing countries too. Although there's a lot of advances in medical science, there's a lot of literature that exists, people still die needlessly from this.
Yeah. We in lovely Australia we've tended to focus on, in the last 2 years, on engineered stone and engineered stone products. However, that's not the only sources of silicosis at all, is it?
No, no. Silicosis is the actual disease caused as a result of respirable crystalline silica exposure. Now, that crystalline silica, as I mentioned, you find it everywhere. It's in so many different applications. We'll use it. If you're making tiles, sometimes they make, put it in paint. They're making glass. There's just so much that it would take days to go through the list of potential products. The reality is that in Australia, there has been a number of cases, and it's actually also happening in Southern California as well as we speak. There's a lot of information coming from that side with particularly Latino workers who are also exposed to the same countertop type scenarios. It's very unfortunate because the reality is silicosis is completely avoidable, right? Exposure is completely avoidable. And so you have this huge number of these young people, or relatively young people working in the prime of their life. They're exposed to something, and unfortunately, they've developed acute, accelerated, and chronic silicosis, and like I said, there's probably a lot more. Because what tends to happen, one thing, Tom, that people don't realize is we tend to look for silicosis when we're looking for diagnosis. But actually, there was a study undertaken in Washington State. They did a study on several thousand construction workers. And what they found was that they kept looking for silicosis markers, but actually hundreds of them first developed COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. So the study sort of alluded to the fact that, are we looking at the wrong things? We're waiting to see silicosis on the horizon, but actually we should be looking for other diseases first, like COPD, like chronic bronchitis, like emphysema. And I agree with that because I get exposed to a lot of stuff as well. I touch wood, I don't have silicosis, but I tend to be more predisposed to chronic bronchitis because of the fact that I'm exposed to things at the point of work. So, it's, and as I alluded as well, there are several other diseases that you can get potentially. They have a lot of information. There's various diseases that are conclusively proven. There are several diseases that they suggestive, but they don't have enough data on it. And also they have those which they suspect cause diseases caused by silica exposure. So when you add it all up, the number of people suffering as a result of exposure to the hazard is probably far higher than they realize, because we're only looking at silicosis. So Australia could learn a little bit about the experience from other countries and look at silica-induced diseases first, and then look at silica chain of diseases.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Australia, I think, has taken one of the strongest stands for engineered stone products. And by July this year, I think the end of July this year, use of engineered stone is going to be banned. Is that going to solve the issue altogether?
I don't think so. I think it's definitely a step in the right direction for sure, 100%. It's a step in the right direction because obviously, as in most cases, occupational generally are avoidable. They're completely avoidable because you're working, you're exposed to something, and then it leads to ill health. So I agree that introducing a ban is good because it will stop additional exposures. But the problem is all of the people that have been exposed already. It may take several years in some cases for some individuals to manifest those signs of silica-induced diseases or silicosis. And in some cases, some people are asymptomatic. They don't actually show the symptoms of, a cough or chest tightness or wheeze or whatever it might be. The symptoms can be different for different people because we're all individuals. But the reality is that putting an end to it right now will help the younger generation or those after July who would have been typically exposed. But all of those who've already been exposed, I think you probably see a spike as the latency kicks in, back down again. And that was exactly what we saw, for instance, UK with asbestos issues.
Yes.
There was a massive amount of exposures. I remember when I was at school in London, we used to play, we had these little Bunsen burners and we had these tripods in our chemistry labs, and that was asbestos. And we used to actually blow it on each other. You'd roll up the balls and spit at one another. We were kids, right? So, but believe it or not, I saw a report recently that showed that they had several hundreds of teachers who died of mesothelioma from exposures at that time when even I was at school, right? So it went a latency period of 15 to 25 years. It kicked in, it peaked, and then it started coming back down again, because by that time there had been some controls introduced in the control of asbestos at work regulations.
Yeah.
And people started taking it a lot more seriously. I think that's one of the things that we're lacking in the issues with silica dust. Like I said, it's a type of silicate. They're both silicates, right? One asbestos and one is silica. They're both silicates. They come from the same kind of family. If we took the same degree of care and a certain degree of fear, people who hear asbestos, they go, oh my God. If we took the same kind of approach of really being cautious and being cognizant of the fact that it is a hazard that is known to be a category 1A human carcinogen, i.e. definitely causes human form cancer, then I think we would start seeing, again, a reduction, because people will be very, very mindful of being exposed to it needlessly.
Yeah. Just on asbestos, we've known about it for decades. Is it still a problem? And firstly, is it still a problem in the developed world? And did we just export the problem to the underdeveloped, or what was traditionally called the third world?
Yes. So it's a very good question. Actually, we've known about asbestos for centuries, and silica as well. We have records going back centuries, particularly with silica and respiratory conditions, going back to the time of the mummies, right? So we've known about the fact that you're exposed to this, these people get sick, and then they die. So when it comes to asbestos, I agree that we definitely took more care and consideration in the last sort of 20, 30 years, which is very, very important for sure. People are still going to be dying of exposures that might have happened several decades ago. I don't know, maybe I'd be one of them. I was exposed to it. I've been exposed to all sorts of stuff, right? But it might be that my predisposition is slightly different. So maybe I do, or maybe I don't. It's a bit of a gambling game. But what happened is that there are several countries, Canada being one, South Africa, even Eswatini. And when there was a global outcry of dealing with the export of, the use of asbestos, and I'm talking about, white, blue, brown asbestos or asbestos-containing materials. Once there was enough political pressure and they started to curtail the amount of exposure, they just shifted their attention and started selling it in developing countries. I remember going to a slum in India once, and I remember walking past this particular shop, and I'm not from there, so I didn't quite understand what was written. So I asked the chap who was with me, I said, what does that say? And he said, this is asbestos. And I looked at it, it was asbestos cement sheeting. And basically what they were doing, they were traders. They were selling this sheeting, and this is only like 5, 6 years back. And they would cut it in the workshop and they would just give it to you. And I've got this great picture of a guy sitting on top of a pile of asbestos cement sheets, smoking a cigarette, and it's like 8 feet off the ground, right? So yeah, I think we as users in the Western world, We just kind of, we're a little bit naughty when it comes to commercial pressures, and we just shifted the attention and sold these things overseas. And I remember helping do a documentary with CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in Canada, probably about 15 years ago. And what had happened was that we realized that as the legislation started to kick in, controls started to kick in, these mines, the mine was actually called Asbestos. The town was called Asbestos in Quebec. They just said, okay, fine, domestic market is closed. We're just going to export it all. Lock, stock, and barrel.
Yeah. So, yeah. I asked that question because my lovely wife asked me a question about engineered stone bench tops not long ago. And she said, there must be years' supply of these, that have been produced that now they can't use in Australia. What are they going to do with them? They're going to destroy them. I said, no, they won't destroy them. They'll probably appear in Indonesia or India or some other country because the protections there aren't as stringent as what we have here. It's one of those things that I think is, I don't know, not very just.
It's an ethical thing, right?
Yeah.
If Tom owns a factory and he knows that he's got a product that is known to cause cancer, then Tom's going to probably think, yeah, you know what, bad karma as well. I'm not going to sell this stuff because, my money's going to be tainted and I need to sleep at night, right? So Tom being a just fellow, he's going to say, yeah, you know what? I'm going to speak to the government. I'm going to say, okay, guys, what do I do with this stockpile? Maybe there's some kind of scheme where you can give it to them and then they will give you back a percentage of that, like they've done with different products around the world. That might happen. That may be a way that they can do it, and then maybe they'll destroy it. The reality is that they've done the same with weapons and things all over the world. War stop, they stockpile it, and somebody comes along, enterprising fellow, and they buy it all out and they ship it off somewhere else where the regulatory controls are less stringent, right? So we wait and see. I'm sure that story will unfold in due course. And I know that there's definitely some kickback from what I've read from industry saying, yeah, but we've got all of this stuff. What do we do with it? So,
all right. Other lung diseases associated with dusts. Is it basically any dust that you breathe in can cause you significant health issues?
So it's kind of a yes and no answer. It depends on the dust. Now, really, if the body doesn't have it naturally, whatever it is naturally, and then you put it in artificially, then the body's going to reject it in some shape or form, right? So it can't be good for the lungs because the only thing that you're really meant to have down there is air. Oxygenation happens, air comes in, clean air, and we pump out deoxygenated air, right? So it really, anything artificial to that process is going to have a potential detrimental effect. There are certain dusts for sure which are more toxic in nature. Those which we commonly hear of are asbestos, silica, coal, things of that type, even general construction dust, cement dust. There's a whole variety of different things. The reality is that it's not good for the body. Once it goes in, the body's going to do something with it. And usually dusts, once they go down into the deeper portions of the lungs, it's very hard to bring them back up again. If it gets stopped by the nose or the throat, in terms of, sputum, and, you can sort of blow your nose or you can cough up phlegm. The body sort of defended itself a little bit, but there'll always be it's whatever contaminant is around there as well. If it's contaminated with something else, construction dust, etc., then you're breathing in a combination of dusts. And so the consequence of exposure could be more complicated, toxicologically speaking, than just one hazard.
Yeah. It was considered in Australia that black lung, for example, from working with coal, was an underground miner's disease. And for a while there, it looked like we'd eradicated it. But then a few years ago, they started finding it in miners who work in open cut mines, never spent a day underground whatsoever. I just wonder, if you work in any sort of mining, tunneling, construction where there's dust, would it be best to just almost as a mandate to be wearing some sort of mask which filtered out most of the particles?
I can see the logic in that in terms of respiratory protective equipment. The problem is that RPE, as in any form of PPE, personal protective equipment, you can get a false sense of security. You know, as a guy who tends to have a beard, you know, for me to wear an orinasal half mask, as an example, is an inconvenience. But if I need it, then, you know, it's mandated by work and I've got to wear it, I've got to shave, etc. It's fine. The reality is it's very uncomfortable. That PPE, whatever it is not always going to be 100% effective. You know, we sweat, you know, we're doing exaggerated movements, we've got all this other stuff. Maybe we're wearing safety glasses, maybe we're wearing muffs, we're wearing a safety, you know, protective headwear, etc. So, you know, the level of protection that we think we're being afforded may not be as high as we think. I definitely think that suppressing the dust at source is probably the best if you can't eliminate it altogether. So elimination definitely is number one. Even when we use the hierarchy of control, it's our first option. But then the engineering controls come down further in that chain. There are several examples that I can give you, and I can give you an example right now, actually. I'm talking to several chiefs of First Nations, Indigenous nations here in Canada. And in a recent job that I had, I was responsible as the Director of Health and Safety and the Environment for one of the largest First Nations in British Columbia. And about 70% of the gold mines in BC are in their traditional territory. And these individuals, this First Nation, were also very enterprising. So they're working on the haul roads, they're dealing with the mines in different capacities. So the guys are being exposed to a variety of different hazards. What we realized was during a conversation, I realized a very, very important thing came up just by chance. And it planted the seed, and I thought, this is a big one. What happened was they tend to hunt, especially around a particular month. It's usually around June or July. They'll take a whole month off. They'll go fishing, they'll go hunting. Because they're working in wilderness environments, they're legally allowed to do that, and employers have to give them the time. But one of these chaps, who was also a hunter-trapper, said, we don't eat the moose anymore. We don't eat the mountain goats anymore. And I said, why is that? And he's saying, well, because what we find is that they taste off. The animals are actually sick when we get them, and so we've stopped hunting in their migratory routes, and those migratory routes quite often are directly affected by environmental exposure to these dusts. So the mining operation, you know, the open cast bit, yeah, they'll have, you know, atomizers, they'll have different types of protection to stop the dust going, but the reality is it's nanoparticles. So the dust will travel. It goes onto the leaves, the foliage, and these animals come and eat it. And now these animals are also getting sick. We know of cases, there's a whole variety of cases of horses, beavers, coyotes, all sorts of animals that can get silicosis as well. And so there's some suggestive evidence coming up from conversations that animals in these migratory routes are also being affected. But also at the same time, when I realized that there was a connection with animals, I realized, hold on, there's communities as well, small little hamlets, you know, And so I started looking at environmental exposure to silica. And I realized there's a vast wealth of information on that as well. Like one in particular that came up, a study in the Himalayas, where this whole town pretty much had silicosis or silica-induced diseases. And they didn't work in mining. But what was happening was it was coming from the bedrock, it was coming from the rock. And because of the dry, arid conditions, they were inhaling the dust, and it would then enter into their homes, etc., etc. And then they'd be using biofuels like coal. And then they're having exposure to that as well. So their health status was considerably different, even though they're living right up in the mountains where the air is clean and pure. They were inhaling the direct consequence of those hazardous substances coming into their breathing zone from the environment and from within their homes. So yeah. I don't know if that kind of answered the question, but
yeah, no, it was good. I'm just curious. You're talking about particles which are seen under a microscope. People working in work environments, could they be unaware that they're getting exposed to dust because it is that small you can't see it?
Yes, 100%. One of the rookie mistakes, particularly what I've seen from our peers as health and safety professionals and others as well, is that they'll use sight as a means of control. And what I quite often remind people is the moment you can actually see a plume, a dust cloud or something, you're way past the occupational exposure limit anyway. Whether it's the 8-hour time-weighted average or whether it's the 15 minutes short-term exposure limit, you're way past it already. Because the amount of respirable crystalline silica that you need in order to exceed that is microscopic. It's very, very tiny. So the moment you see a plume, you're way above that. So it's not a good strategy as a means of control for sure, because that will surely lead to more complications. What's to say that people won't say, well, I couldn't see the radiation. Of course you can't see the radiation. Doesn't mean it's not there, right?
That's right. All right. Nayab, I feel like I could have talked to you for hours and hours and hours, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So I just want to say thank you so much. I'm truly humbled to have someone of your caliber speaking to me. And just for today, we'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much. And I really do look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you, Tom. I enjoyed our chat and enjoyed the opportunity to share and learn from you also. So appreciate that.
Thanks for listening to Health and Safety Conversations with Tom Borne. Until next time, stay safe and enjoy the rest of your week.